Welcome to the 7th interview of Resistance. Today we're going to talk to Sjoerd van Tuinen about the book he edited with Sjoerd Brouwer, To Mind is to Care. The book was published in 2019. Okay, so again, thank you very much, Sjoerd, for having accepted the invitation and the generosity of sending me the book. And I had the chance of reading and enjoying the book. So I start with a brief introductory note about you. As a short assistant professor in philosophy and co-founder of the Erasmus Institute for Public Knowledge at Erasmus University Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Correct me if I'm wrong, if there is something missing. So among your publications are Deleuze's Mannerist Aesthetics, forthcoming 2022, Edinburgh University Press, Speculative Art Histories, Analysis at the Limits, again, Edinburgh University Press, 2017. Peter Sloterdijk Ein Profil, and actually a lot of papers on ressentiment, critique, and care. So I start with the first questions when you're back. And now you're back.
Just getting the router closer to see if the connection gets better.
Okay, cool. Good. Yeah, so I had a very, very short introduction about you. And then, I start with the first question, which is a very general question, short. What brought you to the question of care? The book title is To Mind is to Care, two infinitives in a Deleuzean sense, two becomings. The book proposes ethico-aesthetic models of care in which science does not search for deterministic outcomes, technology does not lead to abandonment, politics does not induce indifference, and art is not marginalized. In a part of the book, you write, I quote you, "We must learn to discern intelligence and generosity in the world. It's not enough to criticize rationality. What more is required?" As the first question.
Well, that's a big question, but indeed, well, let me say first that the book is that I co-edited the book with Sjoerd Brouwer, who is a vice director at the V2 Lab for the Unstable Media in Rotterdam, and they have a very long history in making theory books with cutting edge theorists. In the 80s, they worked with Brian Massumi, Manuel de Landa, and so on, long before these figures became world famous philosophers. And so every 2 years, we make a book. And in this case, we were, of course, not alone working on care. In the art world, I think care is very prominent. You see it with the growing self-consciousness of curators who derive the word curator from the Latin word cura.
Yeah.
Which means care. You see it return in fascination with craftsmanship and making, generally speaking. I think in the contemporary arts, it relates to precarity. In a way, our current interest nowadays within care is both a solution and a symptom, maybe, of the social deficits of late capitalism. And so there's been exhibitions on care in all sorts of, and care has become kind of a buzzword in the discourses of contemporary art. Of course, it also has to do with the rise of feminism, and in particular the feminist ethics of care, and also the lens this provides of reconfiguring or reorienting the notion of the Anthropocene with its masculine overtones. For us, and this pertains more to the quote you've just read, what is decisive, I think, is this this strong intuition that critique no longer suffices. This too is a theme that we are not alone in to theorize. Bruno Latour has famously argued that critique is run out of steam, but other philosophers like Isabelle Stengers will make similar arguments. And this is because I think critique has always been a function of some form of autonomy, of producing some kind of distance or subjective access. And so that's why it's always been at the heart of Enlightenment emancipatory agendas in the West, from Kant to Adorno, and from Nietzsche to Deleuze, I guess. But I also think that, and of course, there's nothing wrong. We certainly should not bury this heritage in any way. By all means, no, don't do that. Don't stop doing it. The critique is crucial. It's not run out of steam. But I do think that the finality of critique can no longer be what it was. And for example, in the late Foucault, you can see this quite clearly. For him, he has a notion of care, the notion of critique, and I think that care is still, well, care, no, I think critique already becomes in a way instrumental to something else, namely care for the self, which is a very limited understanding of care maybe, but care as the finality of critique is something else than what traditional Enlightenment positions up to Adorno and so on have made of it. And that is because I think it is hard to criticize, as Latour would say, what you have to compose with. Right? This being a general problem of the Anthropocene. You cannot really, doesn't make sense to deconstruct or just criticize the authority of experts and so on. You have to also, because they are part of your reality, and you have to, you know, autonomy is no longer what matters in this kind of world. You have to understand much more that the distributedness of your own existence, the structural conditions that facilitate your existence, and that, yeah, whatever you say and do feeds back into. And so, what are the after effects of critique? What are the affects of critique? Not the effects only, but also the affects of critique. I think that becomes much more prominent these days, especially if you look at how critique and intelligence is currently mediated. So yeah, for me, that has to do with the notion of, for us, that had to do with the notion of care becoming more and more important. So to care, to mind is to care. Indeed, two becomings. On the one hand, the notion that to mind is a verb, that the mind needs to be understood as an infinite, not as a substantive, but as a verb in the infinitive, is a notion that comes from pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, who writes this in Art as Experience. And in a way, he also already points towards the idea that, yeah, to mind means to care. That means to try to live. On the one hand, to mind something means that you assume care for it, some kind of responsibility, that you pay attention to it, and that you want what you look at, what you're preoccupied with, that you want it to live. And on the other hand, there is the Hannah Arendt's notion of the life of the mind. And by emphasizing the life of the mind, you emphasize that it needs care. And yeah, and that it will always be involved in power relations that cannot be just criticized, but that involve maintenance and durability. So we try to, with the pragmatists, approach the notion of the mind as something that is not just intellectual, but also emotional and practical. And it basically comes down to a kind of equality between minding and not being indifferent, but also a bit more actively taking responsibility for listening to and learning be able to respond. So care also has to do with what Donna Haraway calls responsibility. But as is tradition at V2, this will immediately be connected to recent technologies, hacker strategies, experiments with AI. And that's why we also start from the notion of Norbert Wiener, one of the founders of cybernetics, who spoke about the care and feeding of ideas. And this is what I mean with care for the life of the mind. Care and feeding of ideas, which of course has to do with the relation between emotion and reasons, but also goes far beyond that. Pointing towards what someone like Stigler would call a neuropolitics, right? Politics of the mind, of thought, in fact. Politics of sense, maybe, as Deleuze would call it. Okay, so that's basically the idea of the book. We asked artists, we asked theorists. Bernard Stiegler is in there as well. Michael Marder, others.
I also had a chance of talking to Janet Pauls, and it was really interesting. I mean, her talk about actually, I mean, she was writing a book about good life, and it has a lot of overlaps with care, like good life and vis-a-vis life, and this universality of life, this singularity of good life. There were a lot of overlaps, and it was quite interesting. Thanks. I mean, it was really an elaborate answer to the reason you started writing or editing this book, actually. One of the contributors of the book, I mean, I have a very short quotation from her, Dula Casa, in the interview asked, judging whether we live in a time of carelessness is an interesting question for those who dare to think in large timescapes. What can make one think that we live in an age of carelessness, especially in Europe? I mean, from the point of view of a non-European or non-Western like me, Europe seems to be the hub of care, from education to nature, from welfare state to equality. But how can we define this state as a careless state?
Yeah, I can imagine. Actually, I was sort of anticipating this question, where Europe appears like the land of milk and honey.
Although I am sufficiently disillusioned. Yeah, I will go back to this question, but let's start with politely and correctly.
So no, I mean, as soon as you connect Europe to its imperialist recent past and maybe present, then of course the notion of carelessness springs into view quite obviously. I think, in the sense of Europe not quite assuming responsibility for its own impact on the globe in terms of in terms of climate change and pollution, for example. But yeah, in our case, we have focused, or in my case, what I focus on in particular is indeed, of course, what comes at the end of a certain Enlightenment heritage, which is very much tied in with Europe. Like Kant says, basically, we have had three types of reason, or three senses of thought in the past. First, we had dogmatism. This is like scholasticism, but also Leibnizian metaphysics, and so on. So dogmatism. And then you had skepticism, Hume, etc. And then comes critique, which is his own project. And so these are like three ways of understanding what it means to mind something. Three philosophical modes of thinking of what it means to mind something. And so in terms of critique, I think, yeah, so there's an identity, I think, between Europe and critique for Kant. But care does not seem to have been Europe's specialty. And well, focusing on the life of the mind and the element in which we think, so to speak, I think what actually we see in Europe these days is a withdrawal from this element, or a kind of self-immunization to this element, and this element meaning the domain of vital problems, as Deleuze would call them. We have ways of rendering ourselves insensitive to them. This is what Deleuze calls the problem of stupidity. And this is very much related to problems of cynicism. Remember how the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk already in the early 80s said that we are living in a time of enlightened false consciousness. That is precisely a time in which critique is no longer going to save us, in which critique no longer comes with courage, but rather with discouragement, in which critique leads no longer to enthusiasm, but to a kind of jaded sense of realism and an assumption of one's own impotence. And more recently, I think, this cynicism in a way has become more active or accelerated, if you wish. Accelerationism, I think, is the most careless prolongations of a long European tradition of Enlightenment critique. And more active cynicism in the sense that people no longer feel bad conscience, or Stiegler would speak about the loss of a certain kind of superego, a certain kind of sociability. People become shameless. So shameless about racism, shameless about sexism, shameless about exhausting planetary conditions of life. So shamelessness, in a way, describes or like an accelerated cynicism is very much described for me as a sense of carelessness, of active indifference and stupidity that currently, has captured the life of the mind in Europe.
Quite interesting. I mean, like, especially when you talk about this relation between critique and courage, and now the relation between critique and discouragement, and this ressentiment in critique, inherent in critique today, is the very fine and nuanced difference between shamelessness and courage. It's really, I mean, they have some overlap. They seem similar, but they are not at all similar. They're not at all the same thing. I mean, in a lot of racist discourse, sexist discourse, we have this kind of like masculine shamelessness, which pretends to be brave and courageous. Yeah. So I mean, I prefer to ask less questions and just let you talk. I'm just learning a lot. It seems that a large part of your contribution in the book and on care is shaped through the distinction you make, Sjoerd, between common sense and good sense. Philosophers such as Bernard Stiegler and Gilles Deleuze have been probably your source of inspiration in different ways. Yet as it comes to Deleuze, the distinction between common sense and good sense becomes more significant, especially as he puts it in difference and repetition. I just quote from Deleuze, which is also, this quote is also repeated in one of your footnotes. While common sense is a norm of identity from the point of view of the pure self and the form of unspecified object which corresponds to it, good sense is a form of distribution from the point of view of the empirical selves and the objects qualified as this or that kind of thing. Good sense determines the contribution of the faculties in each case, while common sense contributes the form of the same. End of quote. What is the significance? What's the significance of this distinction in the likes of Deleuze in its difference from the Hegelian method, which negates, transforms, and preserves the past exclusively on its own terms, especially concerning the question of care.
Okay, this is a very technical question that you're guiding us to here.
If you don't mind, and if you don't care.
You're referring to a footnote on Deleuze, so this is just to refresh my thoughts a little bit in this regard. But we can start by saying that for Deleuze, the task of critique, and as I mentioned, I think critique is still the finality of thought in many ways for Deleuze. The task of critique is, of course, to break not only with the objective presuppositions, let's say the content of our thoughts of the past, doubt everything, as Descartes said, but also to put into question the subjective presuppositions of thought. Are we actually thinking when we think? Do we really know what it means to think, or are we just deluding ourselves? For example, when we think that truth matters, what is it actually in us that wills the truth? Is this not still a very pious notion that thought means to subject or have a natural affinity with the true or the good or the beautiful, or all these things? So all these subjective presuppositions he wants to criticize. And common sense and two sense are the two main subjective presuppositions that he distinguishes. Common sense in Aristotle or in Kant, meaning both a kind of intersubjective sensus communis, where I presume that other people more or less have the same feeling of life and the same feeling of reality that I have. And more psychologically, it means the harmony between my faculties, in particular between the intuition, the understanding, reason, imagination. When this harmony is presupposed by Kant in all our judgments, whether they concern the cognitive judgment of the true, moral judgment of the good, or the aesthetic judgment of beautiful, this always presupposes a kind of natural harmony between the faculties. And this natural harmony also guarantees my identity in a way, the identity of the subject, in relation to which it doesn't matter what the world itself is, can remain a thing in itself, indeterminate, whatever. I'm just explaining the quote here now. So that is common sense. And well, Deleuze, of course, is interested in or anybody who wants to criticize, Lyotard, Rancière as well, the contemporary critical voices, they're always interested in dissenses, right? What breaks through kind of pre-established forms of common sense, which, in a way, allow us to reorient ourselves in the world and reconsider ourselves and our place in the world as well. So dissensus has always been at the heart of the critical project in a way, and Kant did not go far enough for someone like Deleuze. The notion of good sense, Deleuze borrows not from Kant, but from Descartes. It's older, the bon sens. Descartes says good sense is so well distributed that nobody wants to have more of it than they already possess of it. And good sense is something like, an immediate affinity with the true, or it's something like the natural light in which the world appears to us. Good sense tells you that time is irreversible, for example. That health is better than sickness, for example. So it is these notions of common sense and good sense that are going to be criticized by Nietzsche very much. So, and then Deleuze is inheriting that from Nietzsche, taking it further. However, I think we're still in a kind of post-Kantian critical element here. We're radicalizing the basic gestures that Kant had already made in a way, and Descartes as well. But whereas common sense is often regarded as something that is already given, common sense is already out there, and that's precisely what we need to break with. For example, through science is always averse to common sense or through critical philosophy. I would say that common sense is precisely what is not given, what has never been given, what does not even have the mode of existence of givenness, but is precisely something that needs to be constructed. And that is precisely lacking in a world where, as you know, academic practice has completely fragmented after a full century of specialization and under the demands of and the imperatives of the knowledge economy. And then the public sphere is also completely fragmented. Experts are losing more and more authority. Scientists are losing more and more authority. So in a way, common sense, or what's the word? The enclosure of common sense that begins with the enclosure of the commons in the early days of capitalism, in fact, in the primitive accumulation that's part of that. This process cognitively has led to the complete erosion of commons. This is why Whitehead said, well, the new task of philosophy is no longer to investigate the conditions of possibility of the true and the good and the beautiful and so on, all the old metaphysical ideas. And no, it is to weld novelty, the new ideas, new scientific insights, breakthroughs, with common sense. And welding is a very beautiful metallurgic metaphor because it shows that it involves craft, it involves care, it involves attention. And for him, this was kind of the new task for philosophy in particular. And yeah, I think this is already implied in a way by Deleuze's idea of sense, where you are immanent to the problem. You do not posit problems so much as that you are preyed upon by certain problems. And yeah, and problems are a matter of composition, affective composition, of how you engage with other participants in this problem. So from the Anthropocene to, say, neuroplasticity to predictive policing cases, there are all sorts of new situations where common sense is precisely what is lacking, and needs to be reconstructed. So how does philosophy help us make the world a more coherent place? This would be the very general challenge related to common sense. And so my claim is that common sense does not need to be critiqued. Common sense is not what needs to be undermined, subverted in the name of progress or a higher rationality. No, common sense is the real existence, the really existent form, mode of existence of rationality. And so that's why the question of rationality itself is no longer just a question of criticizing illusions or irrationality. It's a matter of caring for its existence.
Yeah, but short, just because of that, don't you think that literature is a better place to look for common sense than philosophy? I mean, especially because literature is replete with affects and percepts, as Deleuze would put it, perhaps. I mean, isn't that the task of literature an art to show us the common sense rather than philosophy?
I'm sure it is. I think it's a task of the imagination. Well, imagination is a very key task in this, but the imagination, of course, can happen in many domains, and there is it's not limited to art or even or worse, even literature, right? I think literature is crucial. Science fiction is doing a lot of work in this regard. Testimonial literature, I think, as well, because it gives voice to what usually remains unheard in the governance of common sense, so to speak.
Mm. Mm.
Yet, I think that the specific task I adhere fully to actually the Deleuzian notion of philosophy as a pedagogy of the concept.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I do think that philosophy has a special task of facilitating or moving back and forth between a common sense to be and the new concepts that are introduced in relation to it. So very much, I think philosophy has a special task, in particular in relation to concepts, but also in kind of being an intermediator and playing a diplomatic role between other fields of knowledge production and yeah, mapping the effects of concepts or functions or artworks, and guiding the ways they feed into one another. There's a beautiful metaphor that I discovered the other day in an old paper from John Dewey called Common Sense and Science. And there he describes that philosophy has to deal, the object of philosophy consists of return waves between science and common sense. So it's like throwing a stone in a pebble in the water. They hit the ground and then they are echoed, they are sent back. Maybe I can just give you this quote here. And the problem concerns the possibility of giving direction, making sense of, in a way, would be the Deleuzian translation of this. Giving direction to this return wave so as to minimize evil consequences and to intensify and extend good consequences, as if it is possible to find out how such a return is to be accomplished. So we're talking about feedback loops between all sorts of modes of production and the way they envelop into one another. I think philosophy is no longer the encyclopedia of the concept. It's no longer the encyclopedia of the mind as it was for Hegel. But if it is more than just marketing, then this is still a very useful description. Although it may mean that we need new technologies for it and that the book is no longer the place to do it.
Sure, there are parts in the book, in your contribution to the book, they talk about tradition. Do you define tradition? Tradition do you define it in a sense as a part of like embodiment of this common sense? I mean, I want to make sense of the relation between tradition, habit, and common sense in this question. In your contribution to the book, you say that, I quote from you, cognitive commons such as ideas, imagination, culture, and public space have become more and more enclosed and co-opted by intellectual property regimes. With critical reflection now ubiquitous and typical of virtually all practices, from our roles as employees or citizens to ongoing processes of monitoring, evaluating, accrediting, and accounting, the element of suspicion appears to have become a liability and a caricature of itself. As a consequence, critique has run out of steam, as you mentioned. Critical reason used to be a function of autonomy and an expression of courage. Now it is a function of knowledge, a function of knowledge economy and an expression of cynical indifference. Although in the beginning you talked a bit about this this cynical indifference and this I mean, the fact of and the relation with courage and discouragement, perhaps you can elaborate about it a bit. Although my question primarily was perhaps two questions, let's say. Like one is the role of tradition. How do you define tradition in relation to common sense? And then how can you relate it to this element of indifference? like this cynical indifference?
Yeah. I'm not sure if tradition is very much at the heart of my work, but tradition, of course. I mean, I think it is obvious to everyone that the past is under attack. That yeah, I think memory, long-term memory especially, is very much undermined these days. And whether this goes through the notion of disruptive innovation, or in terms of just the lack of attention span in contemporary media, and the disappearance of the book as a key medium in the formation of subjectivities plays a key role in this, of course. So tradition, yeah, it's what is always under pressure. It is what melts into air, as Marx Marx's prophecy. And for Marx, this was a good thing. Emancipation means, to a large extent, or has meant to a large extent, detaching from tradition, breaking with tradition, because tradition binds you. But tradition is more than just what Marx called what was it again in the 18th Brumaire? What rests on your shoulder like an Alp. Tradition, of course, also contains potential, or the past contains potential futures, and it's full of future pasts. And that means that it cannot, for us, and yeah, this was already Adorno's insight, of course, that actually any destruction in the name of progress is very, very problematic. So maybe tradition is all we have, just like, there is only one planet on which we live. And of course, tradition is culturally determined, and that makes it a much more complicated concept. There are many traditions, and well, thinking in terms of common sense actually implies, instead in an affirmative sense about common sense instead of in a critical sense, it implies a kind of standpoint that does not tolerate reductionism in any form. So no tradition can be, especially now, in the name of something like a good Anthropocene. No tradition should be allowed to given up or bracketed. Of course, there is an imminent evaluation of traditions. This is also what Dewey speaks about when it's all about the taking care of the return wave between traditions, and countering entropic tendencies, reinforcing negentropic tendencies. And so how does this relate to the notion of habit? Habit being, of course, on the one hand, a force of entropy, of overgeneralization, of insensitivity, of carelessness. On the other hand, habit also being, in a way, all we have. As Nietzsche says, so Nietzsche, adamant hater of habits, well, any habit, any form of order is better than no order or no habit at all. Habit being some kind of basic structural recursive pattern in the world. What we need to fit are small, short-term habits, maybe, but in any case, they are in a way the basic elements that structure our lives collectively, machinically, ecologically, psychologically. It doesn't really matter. Habit is, in a way, for all these pragmatist philosophers, going to be like if it's not God, it's not the subject, it's not nature. What is the ultimate thing in the world? What is the world made up of? Habit, recursive patterns, difference, repetition, one not existing without the other. So yeah, how to invent new habits, how to sustain these new habits, how to make them endure, how to continue traditions in new ways. I think this is very much at the heart of what we need to be talking about right now. I think the time of giving capitalism a push into the back, escaping into the future, futurist, accelerationist fantasies. They're over. They can no longer guide us.
But do you think that Nietzsche, for example, or Deleuze had the same approach to tradition? Like, I mean, I can read in Nietzsche in a sense of like this virtual actual thing. I mean, perhaps for Deleuze, tradition can be read as the virtual, that can be always remade, can be dug through, can be shoveled, all the time. Yeah, can be recreated. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
And so it is actually the task of philosophy in relation to the past. Yeah, I mean, I think in your interpretation, the task of philosophy is just even its relation to the past must be like the relation to the virtual in a Deleuzian sense.
No, I agree, but yeah, so it means that philosophy has to show that the past is not something, that the past is never just the past. That is a task of literature, of philosophy. The past is never just the past. That is one thing. Following Bergson, you have to recreate the continuity between the past and the present, intuit the different durations that traverse us and that come from a past that is actually coextensive with the present. So that is very much the task of philosophy in this tradition of speculative empiricism or radical empiricism, whatever you want to call it. And then it is also to protect it, to protect the past against rapid appropriations. And I think that actually this protective aspect gets much more emphasis in people like Bergson or Whitehead than in Deleuze or Nietzsche. Of course, in Nietzsche we have the famous argument, which about the use and abuse of history for life, and then history is really only to be affirmed insofar as it is a resource for youthful reformations, reappropriations of it. It's very much a glorification of a kind of youthful energy. But that is Nietzsche's answer to what he detects as a certain decay and nihilism of his age. But that nihilism has only deepened. And the rapid attempts to break with the past and appropriate it, we know what they look like, and the whole glorification of youth in Germany, how it articulated. So I think, and this is also what you will find in the late Deleuze and Guattari in the introduction to their book, What is Philosophy? They write from a certain perspective of lateness. Lateness, where you come late, where you are already confronted with a certain disintegration, but without knowing what kind of new youthful subjectivity should replace this. On the contrary, we have no idea. So living in the ruins of modernity, and this is a situation described by Alan Singh, Haraway, and Stenkers, and so on. People will all play a role in the text we're talking about. The text that I wrote. I mean, Yeah, I mean, no, I cannot speak for Deleuze what his stance would have been in this case, or Nietzsche. I can talk about a project of mine that I've been working on for a long time, a book that's now almost finished, and I hope to send to the publisher after summer, called Ressentiment, Pedagogy Concept.
Cool.
It's a book about Nietzsche, of course, and I develop different perspectives, different conceptual personae that will dramatize the drama of a concept such as the ressentiment. And there's the critical standpoint, which is the Nietzschean one. There's, of course, the biopolitical standpoint, which Nietzsche identified with the priest. There is the testimonial standpoint, where the man of ressentiment himself, or in my case, I invoke Jean Améry, a Holocaust survivor, who talks about his own ressentiments. But I also try to add a new perspective, which is that of the diplomat, the person who actually somehow needs to be able to interpolate ressentiment, which is an attachment to the past, in such a way that it doesn't need to first cancel itself out as a form of negation of the negation in order to have a future. So there's a certain elaboration, a certain appeal to ressentiment. How do you address ressentiment itself in a way that it somehow wants to become other than what it is? This maybe is a model for thinking about tradition.
As diplomat, it's like person of diplomat.
We need more diplomats these days.
Yeah,
I think so. We need more diplomats, and the diplomat is not a type in a Nietzschean in the Deleuzian theater. Right? It's one that is added in a way by people like Latour and Stengers. I think take this project further, at least in this regard.
There is I was about to ask more about this relation between philosophy and care, but I think what you already uttered is basically the answer to the question. But now I think there is another question, like when it comes to politics. I mean, what's the role of care in neoliberalism? You suggest that, quoting you, in neoliberal governance, no less than in totalitarian regimes, care is at risk of squashing all difference in its efforts to bring the world under its protection. At stake is precisely the precarity of our encounter with others. Singularity compels us not to give up on manners of individuating a world that is bigger than the sum of the naked individuals who populate it. Word alienation and not self-alienation has been the hallmark of the modern age. So how can you elaborate this relation between precarity in neoliberalism and care? I mean, just
no, it's a great question. Let me look up a few notes that I made about it this morning, actually. Well, one way, what I now think of when you read this passage back to me is how, for example, in my university, I don't know who is going to be exactly the audience of this interview, but there will be some academics, I guess. And that means that those people at least know they're used to a kind of discourse in which managers talk about fostering. They're going to cultivate collaboration, foster this and that. Enable employees to get more enlarge their resilience, increase their resilience. So I think care is very much at the heart of a certain governmental discourse these days. But it is a kind of cuddling to death, because it means, of course, you're reduced to somebody who needs to be able to learn from every bad experience. Every form of suffering is vindicated in the name of some kind of increasing reflexivity or even professionality or resilience or yeah, whatever they want to call it, functionality. And of course, it's also culling to death in the sense that it's just compensating, it's just a symptom of a system that produces precarity and precisely undermines what it tells to foster, what it claims to foster. And of course, this happens not just in academia, but this happens everywhere. I don't know, in my university now, they created I'm not sure if I know the English word for that, a health app, let's call it a health app. So students can constantly, through a system of checks and balances, constantly quantitatively evaluate their own health, how they are doing. And this goes to a central database of the university. So that the university knows the shape in which the students are. So this is like, a kind of total governmentalization of and control. This is, of course, an aspect of what Deleuze called the society of control, where you're constantly monitoring your own, your own vital state, so to speak. So care, in a way, is everywhere. This also, but it goes together with a certain carelessness, and yeah, it does not suffice to criticize neoliberalism. There are too many voices. The critique of neoliberalism, it contains its own entropy.
But does the same apply to criticizing totalitarianism? I mean, would you say that it doesn't suffice to just criticize totalitarian regimes or totalitarianism?
Yeah, let me see. I have to read that quote because what you read included the quote from Hannah Arendt's book on the origin of totalitarianism, right? And I think I remember correctly, Hannah Arendt claims that the problem of totalitarianism is basically that it destroys precisely those that it claims to be identical to. So it's a world without humans, she says, that totalitarianism aims for. And she connects totalitarianism to also the rule of experts, for example. So if you think of contemporary geoengineers, or the whole discourse of geoengineering, then and which includes the prospect that human nature can be enhanced, or that X number of people need to disappear from the surface of the planet for our ecosystem to remain hospitable, etc. Then you're in a certain discourse which does not so much want to rule over men, but rather make a lot of us superfluous. So it's again a system of carelessness, of organized indifference. And neoliberalism in that regard is not very different from more classical totalitarian regimes. That's why eco-Stalinism is not something that should necessarily appeal to us either.
Definitely. I mean, apropos this superfluous attitude, there are like 3-4 quotations from you in the book. You talk about stupidity. Do you take stupidity as synonymous with carelessness? I mean, I can read 1 or 2 of them. I can find them here. Like one of them is, from smartphones to small cities, we are dealing with a reticulated algorithmic form of governmentality that can no longer be regarded as Hegel's objective spirit, since instead of reflecting human judgment, it subjects our brains to an organized and even entrepreneurial form of a stupidity. And the second one is the Anthropocene is a container for a whole system of a stupidity. I mean, like your usage of a stupidity probably, I mean, it just sort of reminds me of Nietzsche's use of a stupidity. Do you mean with a stupidity sense of carelessness or what?
Yes, because in a way I've tried to to identify intelligence as such with a certain notion of care, right? I find this in Dewey and in Whitehead and in Hannah Arendt as well. It was Nietzsche who maybe first suggested that stupidity is very much the ultimate philosophical problem. To harm stupidity was his famous project, I think, as he formulates it in The Gay Science, emphasized by Deleuze and others. So the classical problem of thought would be error and mistakes that accidentally happen, but they don't threaten the good sense and the common sense that make up thought's presuppositions. Then with Kant, the problem becomes illusions, that kind of self-generated illusions self-generated by reason and in its pathological use. So their critique and pathology become related. And then for Nietzsche, it's more about stupidity. And I think if you develop that notion further, you'll also find it at the end, the last pages of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Adorno and Horkheimer discuss stupidity. Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism focuses on stupidity. And in all these cases, stupidity basically describes how we become insensitive to difference, to alterity, how our capacity to be affected diminishes. It can well be that stupidity allows us to affect others much more, precisely because it makes us insensitive. But our capacity to be affected by others, or to engage in relations with others, or to become sensitive to certain demands, certain obligations that a situation might otherwise impose on us. That is what I call entrepreneurial stupidity. And that is something that is very much fostered by neoliberal capitalism. And it leads to depoliticization of problems. It leads to externalization of problems, etc. So yeah, I take all that under the banner of, I bring that all together under the notion of stupidity. So stupidity is a sort of what Stengers calls a mutilation de pensée, de la pensée. Mutilation. So it's also a rendering mute in a way. It's not just a mutilation, a wounding of thought, but also kind of immanent censoring of thought. Cynicism is a form of stupidity.
Right. I think I have one last question, Sjoerd.
Sure.
And this is concerning pandemic. Do you think that pandemic provided us any possibility of attaching ourselves to the common sense? I mean, do you think this potential, there is such a potential in pandemic? I mean, just lockdown, everybody at home, like the habits, are sort of, they're not taken for granted. We are somehow aware of our habits somehow. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting in an interview with Janet Pauls. She argues that at a point, she acknowledges that people living with chronic disease try to live good lives, notwithstanding the difficulty of doing so, without a dream of those living being exemplary. It's a very interesting case that those who are struggling to die, I mean, celebrate life more in that case. Like they're struggling, they're like they're having a chronic disease in her example. But do you think that pandemic had such potential for us to bring us to this common sense? How do you interpret pandemic in terms of care and carelessness?
And apart from the ostentation of the quite obvious necropolitics involved in the calculations of the state, is that's of course the first thing I think about. The deep crisis and in a way the authoritarian, not to say fascist spasm that it has put us all in from day one of the lockdown. So we have that. We have the techno authoritarian spasm that we are in. Then there is technocratic necropolitics going on, where you impose measures precisely according to the maximum capacity of your respective IC units. So that's necropolitics, precisely. There's no better definition of it. So these are, like, in terms of bodies and in terms of subjectivity, I think there's been an explosion of carelessness in the name of care. I think that's what's been going on here, and that is absolutely dreadful. I think there's been so many perverse sides to what's been going on. I haven't written on this subject yet, so I don't have a whole refrain ready for you. But one thing that struck me initially last year was this notion of essential professions, or something like if you're a cop, or if you're a doctor, then the daycares will stay open for your children. Then you get all sorts of privileges, right? And other people who are not essential to society, so there was all governments in Western Europe these days. They made these lists of what is essential, what is not essential. Supermarket workers are essential. A number of other things. And for many people thought, okay, this is going to be this incredible chance, this incredible learning moment where we rediscover some kind of common sense, where we rediscover what's really important for society, what really matters, cops, health workers, educators, these things. But of course, and this is also how states presented it, but of course that's not how it works, because these are not things that really matter to societies. These are things that can be put at risk and that need to go on in order for capital to circulate. So we were completely caught and captivated by certain abstractions new other abstractions than we normally think and think by. Which were still not very helpful in terms of learning from the situation. I don't think we have learned much from the situation. I think many things have been destroyed in the name of care, and will continue to be destroyed in the name of care. So, and that has to do with stupidity. So that's why we cannot think of care separate from the life of the mind and the capacity of the mind to escape from its fascist from the spasms that it currently finds itself in.
And do you think the politics in Netherlands was different from that in Portugal, for example? Or
I happen to know both countries very well. And I realize that you're probably interested in more comparative takes on all these things, maybe. I think the Portuguese government communicates in a more openly authoritarian way. I think there's a tradition of that here. But in practice, and I think also the number of surplus mortalities has been slightly higher here. But in terms of daily life, I also had the impression that there was well, what is the main difference here? The people here, somehow they managed, there was one peak in last January, but within 5 weeks, they went from 15,000 cases per day to less than 500 per day. Whereas in the Netherlands, they had dramatic measures, much bigger than here, with a complete close down of the restaurants, bars, cafes, but never happened. Well, it happened here, but only very briefly. They had it for like 5 months in the Netherlands, evening curfew, etc., and the numbers did not go down. So how to explain that? This is going to be the differences between the European countries were enormous, and the Dutch, being maybe overall slightly more assertive or more emancipated than maybe Portuguese, who have a very strong Catholic traditional culture in many ways. Yeah, they also somehow could not at all get a grip on the situation. Very different from here. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's probably, as usual, mostly infrastructural and economic reasons for this. The Netherlands being very much in the heart of Europe and being completely dependent on trade, international travel, and Portugal being much more at the corner of Europe. But yeah, I don't know. I have not been impressed by the Dutch state. I was pretty dismayed by it from the first day. I was one of the few people who always kind of try to defend Giorgio Agamben's take on this situation.
Really?
I think that Agamben, of course, what he forgets is basically what it takes for Zoe to survive in order to make BIOS possible. This did not seem to be very central in his take on but he was completely correct in saying that this is such a grave attack on our form of life, which has thus been done in the name of Zoe, that it is also intolerable. So he expressed something that was not really tolerated, cannot really be tolerated in any form of rationality that has been guiding so far in the pandemic. Yet in this way, he played what Stengers would call the role of the idiot, right? Tries to articulate something for which he has no words, but by his sheer presence slows down decision making, thinking others, forces others to become a little bit more sensitive, thinking, hey, did I leave something out? And the trouble is, of course, there's many idiots these days. I encountered a number of Querdenker in Berlin last weekend. People with the yellow star for Jews on their face masks. We are the new Jews and stuff. I mean, there's all these anti-vaxxing movements, which are very heterogeneically composed. I mean, these are to some extent also legitimate stances, right? Because we cannot just have this kind of technocratic rationality that, in the name of which you just throw all the achievements of 200 years of social struggle overboard, from privacy to right to go out at night. So the role of the idiot is to care for common sense. Agamben, you need someone like Agamben, who is of course a philosopher. Here in his book, The Use of Bodies, he's very explicit about this. Care for our modes of existence, or what he calls forms of life. And what could be equated to some extent with what with Deleuze we've called traditions. You immediately appear as an idiot if that is your stake. So you cannot have care without idiocy. Maybe that's a good way to conclude.
Yeah, but then in this scenario, the idiot cannot fly, the idiot cannot go. I mean, I was about to go home. I had to do like many tests, many PCR tests. I wanted to visit my family. I mean, now it is sort of mandatory. I mean, you should be jabbed, you should have this vaccination. I mean, like, either you have this vaccination or constantly you have to be tested here and there, you know. So it is a vicious circle in a sense, you know. So, yeah, I mean, I was like talking to friends of like traveling in summer to, I don't know, to France or to Italy. It's, in the end of the day, it's like easier for you to get vaccinated easily. I mean, rather than constantly testing, you know, here and there, and paying. Actually, I paid like to go to Iran. I like 3 times. I paid like €6, like 180 euros just for traveling home. You know. So
yeah, no, we've all had similar situations, but again, I think you participate in carelessness in the name of care. It's the same when you use Gmail or Uber or whatever. Yeah, it's convenient and it's becoming increasingly impossible. We're dealing with a kind of new form of monopoly capitalism, Amazon and so on. Sure, but then that also means you participate. You're describing a situation basically composed of infernal dilemmas. Either you go along with it, or you're just, you know, you're stuck at home and you cannot live anymore. So yeah, there is no bigger reduction of your capacity to think than to feel stuck in an infernal dilemma like that. That is basically what the book is about. The mind is to care. So how to care for, in this sense, some kind of sense of the possible that exceeds the dilemmas in which our lives are currently configured.
Interesting. I thank you very much indeed, Sjoerd. That was really thought-provoking, inspirational as always, and I learned a lot, as I told. And
sounds like it. I look forward to it.
Yeah,
thank you very much for
Sjoerd.
inviting me.
Yeah,
it's an honor to be here, and I'm curious to see what comes of it.
Sure.
Will do. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sjoerd. Yeah, have a great evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye.